You're still there.
Now it says recording in progress, which is what we want. Great. Okay, let's get started. What do you think?
Okay.
Okay, so I thought it would be nice to sort of just start with a bio, right? Like tell us the story of Jeff Fry. Who are you and how did you come to be? And, start at the beginning, Jeff.
Okay. Well, I am a native Hoosier. I was born in Bedford, Indiana. Um, my academic career has been on an ever evolving path. Uh, at one time, I wanted to be a New Testament scholar and was making preparations in that direction,
Hmm.
studying Greek and so forth. Moved into theology, got a Master of Divinity degree, and then went on to Indiana University, where I ended up getting a double major PhD in philosophy and religious studies in 1996.
Where'd you do the divinity degree?
Well, I was in ministry for a while, but decided to, as I said, my thought continued to evolve and became drawn to from philosophical theology just to sort of philosophy in general. Um, and so went to Indiana University, as I said, where I
Hmm.
continued to study philosophy and but also religious studies. Actually took a couple of courses in coaching while I was at Indiana University, and actually taught a class on basketball at Indiana University, which is well-known basketball school. I should
Yeah.
say I was involved in sports all my life. My father was a school teacher and a coach, so I had that background influence as
Was
well.
uh was Bobby Knight ever anxious about you pushing him off the mantle?
I don't think he was anxious about me pushing him off the mantle. I had a few occasions to meet Bobby, and I actually took a class with him. Ostensibly, took a class with him on coaching. And
Ostensibly.
I think he showed up for the first class, and then after that, he turned it over to his assistant,
Hmm.
uh, Norm Ellenberger, who I did develop a relationship with, and which is kind of funny, the fact that Coach Knight only showed up one time because he had a rule in his class that if you missed once, you would get a C. If you missed twice, you would fail the course.
Right.
So it's a bit ironic in that regard.
Well, he was supposedly fairly studious, right? I mean, as
Yeah,
far as I've read about him.
yeah. I mean, he was a quite intelligent man. He was a real history buff,
Yeah.
and I think war history was, maybe one particular area which he had interest in. Of course, he had coached at uh, West Point before he came to
Yeah.
Indiana University.
Yeah.
So he had that background.
Anyway,
And then
sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
I came to Ball State University in 1998. Have been here uh, since then. Uh, Prior to coming here, I taught for a year at Illinois Wesleyan University, and while I was there, uh, they won the Division III National Basketball Championship. Their coach was, I think, Coach of the Year, and they had the National Player of the Year at Division III. Now, was that just a coincidence because I was there? I don't know.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, probably so. And then I had a year when I was a kind of an itinerant professor. I think one semester I taught at 6 or 7 different schools at the same time.
Wow.
It was put a lot of miles on my vehicle during that
Like,
particular time.
yeah, I could imagine. I'm sure your tax returns were a bit of a mess too.
Yeah. And then came to Ball State, as I said, in 1998. And it was really here that I turned to philosophy of sport and have found a home in that area, uh, using sport as a field of application for all my various curiosities and interest, philosophical interest.
Okay, nice. And you've done that quite well. And something I've been interested to watch in the last several years is your sort of move into sort of neuroscience.
Right.
You developed this interest in neuroscience, which is showing up in a lot of your work. I was hoping maybe you could say something about that. I have been paying a lot of close attention to mild traumatic brain injury and concussion and subconcussive injuries and CTE and all these things that are plaguing sports, particularly the so-called contact sports. I'm embarrassed to say I have several of your papers on that printed on my stack over here, but I haven't actually read them yet. If I print the paper, that's a good sign I'm going to read it. It's just that no indication of when I'm going to read it. But maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I was kind of hoping to hear that.
Yeah, well, during my time at Ball State, I've had the luxury of being able to teach a broad range of courses, ethics, philosophy, religion. I taught a course on suffering, course on evil, courses on happiness, philosophy of sport as part of my regular rotation. But I've also been able to teach, as a part of my regular rotation, a course on neurophilosophy, broadly conceived. A lot of the issues discussed in the course have to do with philosophy of mind.
Hmm.
And I've had the good fortune of having a couple of sabbaticals where I've been able to immerse myself in neuroscience, neurophilosophy. And I would take my sabbaticals, a couple of them in Bloomington, Indiana, at Indiana University, and I actually would audit classes in neuroscience, and I even would take the exams for the courses just for fun, keep me a little more accountable. So I tried to develop some background, uh, and then I moved into doing some publications that involve neuroscience and neurophilosophy. I co-edited a book with Mike McNamee on
Yeah.
neurophilosophy in sport. Uh, I've written some stuff on brain injury, thinking about injury in a slightly different light, including how there could be something like emotional injuries that actually are, affecting the brain. I've written on neuroplasticity and the connection between neuroplasticity, free will, and sport. So I've kind of just followed my bliss, my passion, and just kind of gone in the directions that I had interest, and then just tried to immerse myself in those areas to the extent that I could.
Yeah, that sounds like kind of the most traditional understanding of the concept of philosophy, right? The love of knowledge and you just follow wherever it leads you. Um,
I,
that's awesome.
yeah, I've always been interested in. I would say my approach to the philosophy of sport is more of a philosophical anthropology as opposed to examining the structural features of sport, the relationship between sports, games, and play, and all that's important literature, important work. But I've kind of gone in a different direction. I've always wanted my work, at least I've aspired to this, to be in some sense edifying, and been drawn to those people who have, try to write in a clear style, concise. I don't know to what extent I've achieved those goals, but at least those have been aspirations, as I said.
I think you certainly have. For the longest time, I taught a class on college sports, and I taught your coaching a kingdom of ends. I taught that essay in there, and I did that early as a professor, and I learned pretty quickly that that was one of the more engaging papers for students because they found it exactly as you just said, just highly accessible. The way that you write tends to be like just linear and clear and logical and not overly dressed with, you know, jargon. Um, I'm hedging my words a little bit because I don't want to sound like I'm saying, like, "Oh, Jeff, you write like a simpleton." That's that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you write clearly and concisely, and it's quite nice. And it's interesting. I noticed in your notes, you mentioned Nicholas Dixon, who I think is much the same. He writes the same way, and that's part of what I love about his work too. Nick writes some really sophisticated stuff. I think it's really sophisticated and brilliant, and yet simple, right? That's like this gold standard in philosophy is sophisticated and simple simultaneously. Um,
Yeah, I would
yeah.
say that in terms of writing, well, first of all, I really admire Nick's work for the reason that you just mentioned, that he does sophisticated work, but he's very clear,
Hmm.
and he says some things at times that are uh, I don't know, maybe I don't know if controversial is the right word, but things that ideas that some people wouldn't hold,
Hmm.
but he says them in a way that you certainly want to give him a listen, and very clear. And I would put some other people in that same camp whose work is sophisticated but clear, like John Russell, I think, Scott
Yeah.
Kretschmar. I don't want to leave people out, but just to name a few. but I would say that that's kind of what I aspire to. Whether I ever achieve that is another thing.
Yeah. Well, I'd say you've certainly done a pretty good job of it based on the corpus of your work that I have read, not the stack that's outstanding. Um, I hope you said something when you were talking about the neuroscience stuff that and maybe it's just because it's top of mind to me. I recently finished Robert Sapolsky's book, Determined. Have you read that one?
Yeah, at least read parts of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a few years old. I think it was published in maybe 22. But it was really fascinating because one of the things he talked about in there a couple times, you mentioned emotional trauma, and he talked about some prenatal issues that might happen. So, for example, he told a story about how during World War II, I think it was Norway, perhaps, that was cut off from a food supply. And so they had a whole generation of malnourished babies who ended up with excessively high rates of schizophrenia, for example. And so the point, of course, is in his context to talk about free will. And so I'd be curious to hear what you think about that. Let me rephrase my question so it's more clear. I really was interested in Sapolsky's work because he was just talking about all these physiological determinants of outcomes in the mind, to get back to philosophy of mind. And of course, it's in the context of the bigger question of free will. And so I just wonder kind of how you think about free will, given what you know about neuroscience. Where do you land on that?
Yeah, well, Sapolsky is actually, I think, an anthropologist is
Yeah,
at
yeah.
Stanford,
Hmm.
and he wrote this sort of a tome on free will. I think what you are getting at in your example there speaks to this issue of epigenetics, does it not?
Yeah.
And some fascinating discussions revolving around that topic right now. Well, as it so happens, I gave a presentation on free will and sport, and I actually had a occasion to teach a whole course on free will here recently at Ball State for upper level undergraduates. And I think this is one of the areas in which I've certainly had evolving thought. Uh, I guess when it comes to free will, I think one of the big issues, of course, is what do you mean by free will?
Mm.
And there's not just one conception of free will, and depending on how you define free will, then you get the hard determinists who say it doesn't exist, and you get the libertarians and say it does exist, and then you get the soft determinist or so-called compatibilist. But it depends. It depends on whether you think free will means that you could have done otherwise in the very same circumstance,
Hmm.
nothing having been changed in that circumstance. So I think you have to always preface this discussion by saying, well, what do you mean when you talk about free will?
Yeah.
And given that sort of libertarian notion of free will, I have to say I'm a bit hesitant, and more so these days, to endorse that view that I could have actually done otherwise than I did in the very same circumstance, given the person that I was with all the influences, environmental, genetic, and so forth, pressures at that moment that I could have actually done otherwise in some meaningful sense. Now, so I guess that would be my first shot at giving a response to your question.
Uh, so lots of things pop to mind hearing you say that. First of all, I wonder how your students received that class to do a semester long class. Did you upset them? Or because I think my experience is that most students come into the room without a concept of free will, as you pointed out, but a sort of intuitive understanding of it and an intuitive belief in it.
Right.
And then you start to sort of pull away the bricks that are the foundation of that. You hammer chisel at those bricks and they start to crumble. And I find that students often get defensive and don't want to face that. Did you have that experience at all?
Uh, Not so much, I don't think. We covered so many different authors who defended a lot of different positions. I mean, you've got certainly respectable philosophers who are still defending various, varieties of libertarianism and
Yeah.
libertarianism in the metaphysical sense, not the political
Yeah, yeah.
sense,
Right.
as well as compatibilism and then hard determinism. Uh, so based on their writing and their discussions in a class, which was a small class, so it was conducted sort of like a seminar, and they gave presentations, and there were students who held perspectives across the board by the end of the semester. But I mean, I think I agree with you that many people at least come to that discussion with a sort of intuitive sense that, I did something in some situation, but I could have done otherwise. I really could have done otherwise. So in other words, a sort of libertarian perspective on that. But that is a kind of first naivete,
Mm.
as it were,
Yeah.
and then you can be exposed to all kinds of other views and suppose problems with that view. Maybe you come back to it. Maybe you come back to it and endorse it. Maybe you don't. And that really speaks to my own evolving thought about philosophy and the philosophy of sport, and particularly in the philosophy of sport, that we do have a lot of preconceptions that we bring to the philosophy of sport, and sometimes I've referred to those as naive attitudes, including, I think, often this sort of acceptance of this libertarian conception of free will and some entailed notion of responsibility, dualism, a kind of mind-body dualism, ideas of meritocracy, which is also at least related tangentially to the free will discussion, level playing field, and so forth. But this discussion of free will is certainly one of those areas in which I think we do well to examine our preconceptions about that view and see if we think after some critical discussion we
Yeah.
still want to endorse that.
That's all fascinating to me too. And you've done more work in this area than I have. In fact, I haven't published anything on this myself, but I've read and thought a lot about it. You reminded me of a story which I'll share quickly because I don't want to be the one doing all the talking here. You're the you're the feature. Um, Years ago here at Miami, I was a real privilege. It was an honor. I got invited to give the graduation talk. We have a graduation for our student body, obviously, and then we have divisional graduations, but we also have a student athlete graduation. They have a separate ceremony. And I work a lot with student athletes because of sports and so forth. So I got invited to give that talk. A number of student athletes asked for me to do it, which I was like, wow, that's awesome. That's cool. And I had been reading and thinking a lot about free will. And so I went to that talk and I tried to give a talk that was essentially about gratitude and grace and thankfulness for who these people are. Because to be a student athlete in Division One athletics, you have you are special. I mean, you are uber elite if you are a Division One student athlete. And so I think there's some gratitude there. And so I gave this long talk about I didn't put it in quite philosophical terms, but it was about determinism and free will and moral luck and luck generally conceived. And I said, one of the things I said, is like, you're all here. You're all blessed with a certain genetic disposition. You're all born at the right time and place such that you can actually do this. You found yourself in a context where these opportunities were available to you and you took advantage of them. You're not in the operating room right now. You're not in the recovery room right now. You're not doing physical therapy right now because, athletes are, of course, at much elevated risk of all these. You all made it through 4 years of intercollegiate athletics, mostly physiologically intact and psychologically intact, probably. So I was just pointing out, the millions of ways in which they could have not gotten here. They could have been picked apart by this machine. And what a beautiful thing it is that they've come out in the back end. They've earned their degree. They've played their sport. They've got their letters. They've got their relationships, their friendships, their friends, gratitude, grace for all these things. So it was meant to sort of be like, let's just reflect and talk about how damn lucky we are to be here because this is awesome. And I had a good time with it. And I don't know if the students did it or not, but I was interested in, and this will tie back to something you said earlier. After the talk, I was approached by a couple of parents. One of them was a um, orthopedic surgeon. He was a surgeon. And so he came up to me and he was very complimentary. He said, you're exactly right. Like I treat these athletes all the time. They have no idea how lucky they are to get through all this. And then I was approached by a mother and she was kind of incredulous and she was upset with what I had said. And she kind of just sternly stood very close to me and she said, "You don't understand. It's God. It's God. These are the blessed. These are the privileged few." And so my response to her, I was just trying to be polite, of course, and I said, I've considered that. That's all I said is I've considered that. But I thought that was kind of a stunning thing to say because what I thought and didn't say was why these few and why not so many others who were not blessed by God. Um, and don't necessarily want to get into theology, but it was an interesting experience to talk about that stuff. I wonder how any of that lands with you.
Oh, well, actually, at several points, I have been thinking about moral luck for a long time. In fact, my dissertation, which was a dissertation in moral psychology, was on self-esteem, moral luck, and the meaning of grace. And what I tried to argue was that one could, because of the way it seems that self-esteem seems to hinge on a variety of factors, including the kind of environment that you grew up in, that one could argue that self-esteem is in some respects a function of moral luck. Uh, and then one could even maybe conceive of that as a kind of a grace, a gift that you were given. But more recently, I've been thinking quite a bit about possible worlds
Hmm.
and counterfactuals. Uh, David Lewis has famously argued, for a modal realism, the idea that there's actually an infinity of other worlds out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one wonders, well, what if this had happened or this hadn't happened? How might things be different in this particular life that I'm living right now? Of course, now some people would say, if things had been different, would that really be you? Because if you take Leibniz seriously, two things are identical if they have all the same properties.
Mhm.
If something had changed in my life, then that individual might have different properties. And would that be someone who's very similar to me, but not me? But aside from that question, one can certainly think about, well, things might have gone differently. Why did they end up do I really wish that they had gone differently? Now, that's a tricky question. One can always say, I wish I had done this, and I wish I had done that. But without knowing exactly what would have followed from those counterfactual decisions, I mean, how can one really, assert that with great confidence? But with respect to your particular occasion of giving that talk and then hearing the responses from people, I think, it's interesting. Do some people deserve good
Hmm.
luck in life? Or that divine providence smile upon them? Randy Fiesel, in his book on sport and good lives, talks about this notion of athletes sometimes saying that adopting this view, all things work for the good. All things work for good because there is, the hand of providence behind them, and he calls into question that view. I mean, can it really be the case? I mean, it kind of gets back to Leibniz view. This is the best of all possible worlds. If that's the case, why would you want to change anything? This is the best
Hmm.
of all possible worlds. So, yeah, I think it would be difficult to have that conversation with someone after giving a talk on that subject who adopted that position. So,
It was tricky, and it was, it's in front of a moderately large audience too, and so of course I don't want to, I had to tiptoe around it, but it was an interesting. She certainly pressed me to think differently about it, which is nice. Kind of, as you said with Nick Dixon, the phrase I always think about with Nick, sorry to back up on that, is, he's a lot of. You said I wouldn't call them controversial; I'd call them heterodoxical. There's just a little different way of looking at things, which is good.
we have to take one example in terms of pieces that I really found thought-provoking that Nick has written. And just in general in the philosophy of sport. He wrote a piece on blowouts,
Yeah, that's great.
and it provoked some interesting responses, including Fiesel's response to that work. But Nick argued there's nothing intrinsically wrong with blowing out another team.
Yeah.
and that one really has no reason to feel humiliated if one has been blown out. There's
Yeah.
nothing, intrinsically humiliating about being blown out. And then I think Friesel responded, well, it might not be humiliating, but it could certainly be embarrassing and, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it was, crystal clear piece, took a position that certainly not everybody would agree on, but really thought-provoking.
Part of what I loved about that paper is that he sort of forces you to think to yourself, well, if you shouldn't run up the score, isn't that paramount to saying that the only thing that matters is whether you win or lose the game? As soon as you've secured the victory, stop scoring points. That's the
Yeah,
same thing as saying the only thing that matters is winning and losing.
right.
And virtually no one in sport ethics would say that. The other thing, interestingly, this brings us full circle. I used to teach that paper too, and I would talk about Bobby Knight because Bobby Knight was very much more focused on the quality of play than the win or the loss. There's a famous interview when he was at Texas Tech. He was really, he's also famously sour tempered. And he's in this press conference and he's complaining and a reporter finally almost incredulously asks him, he says, coach, you're in a really bad mood. What's the problem? You won the game by 22 points. And Bobby Knight says, yeah, but we played like shit. And I always think of Nick Dixon, like they won by 22 points. They ran up the score, but he's mad because their performance was not optimal. So, and I think like that was Dixon's point. It's more
Yeah,
than the score.
I think Knight's quest was always for the perfect game,
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
that means. I don't know what that would mean actually. If you think about that very long and hard, it will give you a headache. But in terms of this, other things besides winning and losing, some people would argue, well, an athletic contest is not just trying to determine who was better, but how much better were they
Yeah.
than another team. And if you win by more points, that might indicate that, something that does not indicate merely by looking and saying, well, so and so won in that contest.
Yeah.
Sometimes it becomes a question of whether it's the results are very meaningful if you pit two teams against one another, whether it's such a discrepancy, such as I remember reading about a women's high school team that defeated another team 100-0.
Yeah. I saw that case too.
And the coach of the winning, they were like pressing at the end of the game and they were exuberant and so forth.
Because they wanted to score 100 because that's such an
Yeah.
unusual feat. Yeah.
And that there were some repercussions from that.
Well, you may recall that the coach was pressured to resign and he eventually did. The winning coach in that game resigned over that game.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there was some question at the end about invoking the golden rule.
Hmm.
Do unto
Yeah.
others, you would have others do unto you. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Huh. Well, that's all. I mean, I wish I were better equipped to sort of talk to you about some of the philosophy of mind stuff that you know. I wonder what you think. This is a selfish question because I'm interested in it. And it's top of mind, just kind of funny. So I was talking with my wife last night. She just got home from vacation, so I hadn't seen her in a week. She went to Jamaica with her sisters, which is nice. Um, but anyway, I said, while you were gone, the cat's been sleeping on the foot of the bed. He always sleeps, he sleeps on our bed. And I've noticed he has this pattern when I kind of move my feet in such a way, he'll kind of give little quiet meows, he'll just meow, just to sort of, and I said to her, the more I think
maybe that's
about
sleep
that,
apnea. Sleep apnea.
well, that's a separate issue. Um, but I said to her, it's fairly clear to me, it's empirically difficult to say. I feel like he's signaling to me to say, hey, I'm down here. I think he has a theory of mind that if I meow at the right volume, he will know not to flail his feet around and kick me. I mean, I know I'm sort of empirically stretching here, but it seems to me that the cat is signaling to me not to kick him by audibilizing and hey, I'm down here. And again, I know how empirically difficult that is to square. What do you think about that? Do you think that non-human animals have that sort of, I guess I'll call it theory of mind? I mean, I think that they think that others think to do the metacognitive thing there. What do you think?
Well, I know that that's an area of which you have particular interest and have done research, quite a bit of research in ethical treatment of non-human animals,
Yeah.
and specifically in the area of sport. I think one could say, I don't know how we can ever know for sure
Yeah.
if there's something, if there's a light on there, if there's something, mental activity going. But I might say the same thing about you or any other person I
Yeah.
engage as well. How do I know for sure? And then we might start looking at the, parallels in terms of an anatomy, having a brain or nervous system, uh, physiology, behavior, and so forth. And one might say, well, there seems to be some reason at least to think that that could be the case.
Yeah.
I know, Descartes argued that he didn't think that was the case because non-human animals, he said, didn't have language
Yeah.
capacity. He tied thinking and consciousness closely to capacity for language. But I think it's, accepted by a lot of scholars today that not all thinking takes place in language.
Yeah.
So not being able to speak in English or French or what have you might not, might not be a
Yeah.
disqualifier in that
Yeah.
respect.
Descartes been beaten up on that. Maybe fairly so in my view. I think Tom Regan in his book, The Case for Animal Rights, has a chapter where he talks about where he goes in pretty hard on Descartes on that and makes a pretty convincing case in my view. You mentioned parallelism too. James Rachels wrote a book called, gosh, what's the name of that book? It's on the shelf behind me. Created from Created from Animals or something like that. I forget what it's called. But anyway, the whole premise of the book is parallelism and anatomy and evolution, and where he talks about the relatively high probability that those that are built like us work like us. So the whole book is dedicated to that, and he really it's a really terrific book that didn't get as much attention as I think it should have. It's a little bit old. It was published in '99, I think. It was a really good book, though.
Well, John Searle has had a series of dogs uh, whom he has always named after philosophers. And on occasion, he would bring one of his dogs, like one of them was named Tarski, for example. Uh, and he would bring his dogs to class occasionally. He would say in his lectures, I have absolutely no doubt that Tarski, is a thinking being.
Hmm.
And he would draw on, this kind of parallels and, brain and nervous system behavior and so forth. I guess I would want to, if I'm going to err on the side of being conservative and assuming that they do
Yeah,
feelings that there's some kind of mental processes going on there. I think that the consequences of not assuming that and being wrong would be pretty significant.
yeah. That's the approach that I've often taken, exactly as you just described, because what if their mental experience, especially the sort of so-called higher animals, is effectively ours minus language?
Right.
Then it looks pretty darn bad.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
often happens, and
Yeah.
that's not out of the realm. That's certainly again, it's empirically incredibly hard to know. But as you also pointed out, I, it's incredibly hard to know that I'm not speaking to a hologram right now, like with any
Or
with a degree of certainty.
or at least a zombie.
Yeah, perhaps that. Perhaps that. Um, Hey, since we just had a laugh there, what another thing I wanted to talk to you about. I don't know how long I've known you now. I started coming to IAPS, International Association of Philosophy of Sport. Geez, a little more than 10 years ago, and I think I've missed one or two. So I've known you for a little while. But my first impression of you, Jeff, was just your sort of delightful disposition. I mean, you're just a fun person, I think, and I do mean that as a compliment. But you have a wonderful sense of humor. And I've had debates with some of my friends about the role and place of humor in philosophy and, whether, we could talk about Bernard Suits, for example, whom I also thought was just, I never knew Bernard Suits, but I've read so much of his work and I just find him fantastically funny. So here, that was a person who clearly could integrate a robust sense of humor with, astonishingly good philosophy. How do you think about that? Do you think there's a role for humor in serious work?
Oh, definitely. Well, and to whatever extent that I do actually exhibit these propensities that you mentioned, I probably, you know, my father was someone who had a good sense of humor, and he wasn't a joke teller, but he wasn't above pulling some pranks, that were harmless, that get a kick out of. Um, there's been some, sophisticated work written by philosophers on humor.
Yeah,
I think was a Cohen from the University of Chicago wrote a book on philosophy of humor. Uh, Other people out there.
I
Uh,
should I should look that up and
yeah,
make a little note of it.
it's not the only one. Uh, I don't know. This coming out of my background with in theology and ministry as well, homiletics. How do you get people to pay attention? How do you keep their attention? Something at the beginning to capture your attention, some anecdote, some story, 3 points, not much more than that.
Hmm.
And then maybe a kicker at the end. A dose of humor doesn't hurt as well.
Yeah,
I don't know to the extent that that has influenced me, but sometimes you can just probably make profound points also by using humor.
yeah. That's an old idea too. I mean, you know, the satirists have been around for a long time. I teach a capstone class in our liberal education curriculum where I talk to students. We do a 4-week module on critical thinking. I could do a whole class on critical thinking. We do a 4-week module on it. And at the end of that, I show them clips from The Daily Show, the show on Comedy Central, The Daily Show. They did a segment one year on then the Washington Redskins mascot, now the Commanders. But I show them the clip because I point out to them that that satire, when well done, is not just for a laugh. I mean, it really is serious. And again, that's an old idea that as you were just articulating, but it's also a nice teaching tool in a critical thinking course because it's like I like it because I talk to students about like, hey, when you sit down and read a paper, you do that at your pace, in your temperament. It's your setting. The mood you're in might dictate how you think about it, how hungry you are, what time of day it is, how fatigued you are, whatever, but it's at your pace. Whereas when you watch this clip on The Daily Show, it's not at your pace. It's very fast. And there's jokes in there. And there's serious content in there. And so you hear the joke, you get the little dopamine bump, you have a laugh, you're having a good time, and you're thinking, I like this. Because your body's telling you you like this. Because you're laughing and that dopamine feels good. And I'm reminding them, like, that's all part of the rhetoric. That's all part of satire. That's all part of sounds like a loaded term, but that's manipulation. You're being manipulated by the satire. And it's powerful. I mean, if you do that well, you can be incredibly persuasive in such a subtle way that people don't realize the heavy hand that you've just laid on them. It can be really effective.
Yeah, you laugh a little bit, you feel a little more open, a little less
Yeah.
defensive, a little
Yeah.
more receptive. This person is not so threatening.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I remember giving a paper when I was talking about Chicago Cubs fans. This is back before the Cubs got good, and how the fans, come back wait till next year, wait till next year, wait.
Yeah.
And a former announcer, broadcaster for the Cubs, said once, "Says any team can have a bad century."
Was that Harry Carey?
No, I
Okay.
think it's Jack Brickhouse, maybe. Any team can have a bad century. But this idea of humor, gosh, you go back to Kierkegaard and the idea of using irony and
Mm.
indirect communication. Uh, there was a famous American preacher who taught at Candor Theological Seminary at Emory University by the name of Fred Craddock. And he developed this notion also of indirect communication. Instead of just like clubbing people over the head, you sort of move in there indirectly and then then the truth sort of hits you
Hmm.
uh, in ways that you didn't expect.
Mm.
So I think there's a long tradition of that, actually. As I say, thinking about Kierkegaard or even Socrates, Socratic irony, and um,
It's
so
definitely, there's definitely an art to it. You may know this. I was a student of Bill Morgan's, and I think Bill's fantastically funny too. He is very subtle in his humor. And sometimes it's not subtle at all. Sometimes he's like grasping for a laugh, which is also funny. But other times he can be really subtle about it, and he's I think he's gotten so good at it that he doesn't even realize he's doing it anymore. But he's really good at that. Another thought you gave me, and you mentioned Randy Frizzell earlier. He wrote a really interesting paper on profanity and vulgarity in sports, which I thought was fascinating.
yeah,
And and that among other ideas, you said before, it can hold attention. Often when I'm teaching, I teach in 75-minute segments. You know, you're dealing with college students. They're busy. They have these crazy schedules, especially student athletes. Then you ask them to come and sit down. It's a hot spring day. Then they come and sit in the air conditioning and just be still for 75 minutes and don't get bored and don't be tempted to fall asleep. It's like kind of asking a lot of them sometimes, not to give excuses to my students too easily. But I've gotten into the habit. I've noticed, and this is odd because it's not really who I am. I'm more profane in class. And I have noticed that part of that is me sort of reading the room. And so I'll notice like the students are getting tired. We've been sitting here for 50 minutes now. And so I'll get colorful with my language. I'll use a little profanity and all of a sudden like, oh, did he just say that? And all of a sudden they're with me again. It's like I'm not doing it just to be vulgar. I'm doing it because it will get your attention. And it seems to. But I'm really self-conscious about it. The last thing I want is to see my teaching evaluations, like his language is coarse. So,
yeah. I actually have in the last few iterations of my philosophy of sport class, I've used Frizzell's book on philosophy, sport, and good lives, and I think
yeah.
that's the book that has the chapter in it on profanity in sport. And I actually only had him read that once. I did venture to do that once. Uh, but so the genius of that chapter is that he outlines all the different functions that profanity can serve in addition to being abusive.
Hmm.
Not all uses of profanity are abusive. They can be used just to emphasize a point or to let off steam or, all kinds of functions. It might have been Bobby Knight who said he thought the F word was the most expressive word in the English language.
Right.
It has so many different potential uh, functions. But you're probably braver than I have. I have on a few occasions used profanity, but
I don't know if brave is the
not a
right word
lot.
for I don't know that brave is the right word for it. Foolhardy, maybe.
Intrepid.
Yeah. Uh, so sorry. I mean, it's fun to talk to you and sort of go off into talking about lots of broadly philosophical things, which is I think fair and accurate. I tell my students I teach an ethics and sports course, and I always tell them to notice that it's not sport ethics, it's ethics and sports. I think of it, this is debatable, but I think of ethics and sports as it's just applied ethics. It's ethics layered onto sport. I do think that there are some interesting and unique cases that arise that sort of create these little bubbles or domains that appear to be incredibly unique to sport, like combat sports, for example. That's such an odd domain of ethical behavior. I mean, we'll sit down together and we'll literally write a contract about how we're going to violate every norm and standard of a decent society, and we're going to become barbarians for 90 minutes. That's incredibly bizarre. And it's also just fascinating. Whether never mind the valence of it, whether it's good or bad, it's just fascinating that people will come together in mutual agreement to engage in martial conflict. Like, what a bizarre human thing to do. But anyway, so I was trying to pull us back towards sport a little bit. I had given you that list of influences, and I saw that you had Searle on there. I also saw that you had Dan Dennett on there. Speaking of, folks who defend the notion of free will, because Dan Dennett was famously a free will proponent. But I wondered if maybe you could talk about your influences, either philosophical or religious, or um, how that sort of bends you towards sport. So just a broad question about like who influences you and why on sport philosophy.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I did a double major PhD in philosophy and religious studies at Indiana University. And as it happens, the philosophy department was really heavily analytic. In religious studies, though, I had a mentor who was a Husserl scholar.
Hmm.
So a top-notch Husserl scholar, phenomenology.
Yeah.
So I was actually exposed to both of those traditions, influences, and they both worked their way into my uh, working into my publications. I was always very taken by Kant's work in ethics and this idea of treating people as ends in themselves, respect, not just using people, working that into thinking about coaching ethics, what it would mean to treat athletes as ends in themselves. Just to, touching on what you were talking about, combat sports. I don't know how broadly encompassing you meant you would use that term, but thinking about American football, uh, I think it's a troubling sport. I mean, there's beauty, there's grace. In some ways, I'm really attracted to the game, but I mean, at the beginning of every season, there's going to be a number of people who are going to end up with their knees
Yeah.
torn up,
Life-altering events.
yeah, life-altering events. You wonder about, the ever increasing weight load the athletes are bearing. Offensive linemen now who are 300 pounds.
Hmm.
Uh, what do coaches think about this? What do they tell the families of these athletes? I think it's almost too simple to say, well, they're doing this of their own free volition. You know, I don't know if that's really a satisfactory response. Anyway,
You, just to piggyback on that, I also teach in that ethics course a module on CTE and concussion and so forth. And students will sometimes say, well, they know, and I have lots of football players in class, and they'll say, well, we know what we signed up for, just as you said. And I don't want to sound like some Marxist notion of false consciousness, but I push them on that and say, it's one thing to sort of abstractly know that I'm doing a dangerous thing, but it's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger curve. If you push for details, you think you'll find that your competence is actually much lower than you think. And so I tell the students, if I write a 100-point multiple choice quiz on everything we currently know about brain trauma, concussion, neurons, neuroplasticity, recovery, CTE, all of it, 100-point quiz and give it to every football player, what do you think they're going to score? And I haven't done it, of course, but my speculation is I think they'll score about random distribution. I think they'll effectively be guessing.
mm, wow.
So they know abstractly that they're doing a dangerous thing, but do they know, about tau protein deposits and early onset dementia? And I
Yeah,
doubt they do. There's no
yeah,
incentive to tell them those things.
yeah, and it's kind of related to this idea. There are the known knowns, the known
Yes. Yeah.
unknowns, and then the unknown unknowns.
Yeah. And I think that third category, there's probably a lot in there still.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's interesting you would say that. I coached for years. I coached for, well, not a lot of years. I coached for 6 seasons and I coached American football. And I agree with you in that, I grew up playing that game. There's so much about it that I find it is odd to describe it as beautiful, but I would. It's really beautiful. I mean, we ran a sophisticated running attack, and if you can coach your offensive lineman well and block really well, you can produce ballet. I mean, you can produce some beautiful things with those 5 players on the inside doing their thing and opening gaps to run through. And it's like, it's hard to believe that you can pull that off with 5 players. It's beautiful. But, we had a player once in the last season that I coached who got a terrible concussion. And this is a high school kid. He's 16, 17 years old. He has no ability to form short-term memories in the short term. He's being asked the same question over and over by trainers. He's giving the same response again and again as if it's the first time ever. His pupils are dying. I mean, it was it was horrifying. It was horrifying to see a 17-year-old kid utterly incapacitated by an injury on the football field. And that really stuck with me. And that was my last season. And I told my wife, I was like, I can't show up next year and tell these parents at a preseason meeting, we're going to take good care of your sons. They're going to be fine. We're going to make them better. I can't promise you that. There's a high probability they're going to, as we said before, end up with a life-altering injury. I just, and I just couldn't do it. I feel bad saying it. Well, I don't feel bad saying it. It's just, it's a tough thing to really confront. When you really confront the ethics of that, it's tough.
Yeah. Yeah. Tough enough to stay healthy when you're dealing with non-contact sports,
You're right. Right.
just like running.
Yeah.
Just It's a little bit off topic, but a few weeks ago, I was out on a run by myself, and something slammed into me, knocked me to the ground. I looked out of the corner of my eye, and I could saw these large wings flapping. And we live in an area where there are a lot of Canada geese certain
Wow.
times of the year. And I surmise that probably in flight, it just hit me and
Oh my gosh.
knocked me to the ground. I got 5 stitches in my elbow and 3 stitches in my knee.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah, the people at the prompt care said, "Well, you're never going to live this down."
That's a new one. When you
Goose by a
began this,
goose.
when you began the story, I was gonna guess that perhaps a white-tailed deer had run into you because they do, they're known for kind of randomly sprinting around sometimes. Um, wow, Canada
Yeah,
goose.
totally blindsided. I don't know if I was, disturbing a nest or something. I didn't seem to be,
Huh.
but anyway. But as I say, even in non-contact sports, you can get injured. Then, when you're hitting other people and twisting joints and so
Yeah.
forth. Yeah, I mean, adds
Yeah.
another degree of complexity there.
Well, so I know you're an avid runner. And you mentioned Husserl. I've been trying to read Merleau-Ponty. Scott Kretschmar has pushed me hard on that, and I don't want to let Scott down, but the more I read Merleau-Ponty, the more confused I get. But as a runner, I mean, do you think of when you're running the way that you do you think of that as a fun, I mean, it inherently is a phenomenological experience? Is that a part of it for you? How do you think about that? Do you think seriously about running or you just do it?
Um, I think it depends on the day and
Yeah.
how I'm feeling on that particular day. But oh gosh, sometimes it's more like getting it done
Mm,
rather than just doing it. Uh, Not every day is a good day,
yeah.
But on the days when it seems easier, I mean, it's more like, joy that I'm still able to do it.
Mm,
And I don't know. I wrote a paper once on running as a active endurance and experience of suffering and what suffering can teach us and how some people have this sort of ecstatic notion of suffering, this kind of self-transcendence, which sounds kind of paradoxical, given that it would seem that if you're suffering, you can't
mm.
escape yourself.
Yeah, you're sinking into yourself, not away
Yeah,
from
sinking
yourself.
into yourself, right. I don't know if I have anything profound to say
Hmm.
on that particular topic, but
Okay. I'm just always, my wife was a marathoner for a while and I would train with her periodically, but it's never really been my thing. But it's interesting. I'm sure you've done this. You've run marathons, haven't you? Yeah, I thought so. I find marathons to be just a spectacular event. And I mean spectacular in the literal sense of like to go and watch the people do the thing they're doing. Um, they're just incredible. I mean, some people push themselves so hard that they're utterly incapacitated, and others are just out there literally drinking beers every fifth mile, you know. It's the carnival. It's a carnival and this full spectrum of performance. It's really kind of a neat thing. I talked to Pam Sailors about that too, which was kind of neat. Um,
I would say that running at times has been a quite emotional experience for me. Uh, I had I mean, I'm kind of addicted to running. I had a string of 10 years where I didn't miss a day of running, literally
Wow.
at least 2 miles a day. And I've had other strings, 2 or 3 years. And uh, when I've had, well, to speak a little autobiographically here, uh, over the last year or so, I got sick and I had pericarditis, inflammation of the
Oh,
pericardium. It
yeah.
caused me arrhythmia. Uh, yeah, I mean, I was actually on sick leave for like a full semester of teaching here at Ball State. And I really wanted so much to be able to run the Indianapolis Mini Marathon this year to get back into that. But I was only able to train, most I had run like 3 miles at a time. This is a half marathon. And 2 or 3 weeks before the Indianapolis Mini is when I got hit by the goose, which set me back a little bit. But so I went ahead and did. I'll see what I can do, and I ran the first 7 miles, walked about a half mile, ran a mile and a half, then walked and ran the latter part of the of the run, and finished. I should say that the year prior to that, I had my knee blew up with psoriatic arthritis. So that was another thing that's
Oof.
been bothering me. And I went to the expo the day before the race in any case because I wanted to get the number and I wanted to meet Frank Shorter and because he was there at the expo. He's there basically every year. And so I got to talk to him and he signed my bib and I told him I wouldn't be able to run last year. And he wrote on there, "You'll be back."
Hmm.
And I took that bib and I put it on the top of my dresser. And every once in a while, I would look at that during the ensuing year. So in May, when they have the mini marathon, I did my usual thing. I got up early, went to Indianapolis and ran. And about halfway through the race, you run a lap around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And then you run back downtown. You start downtown, run out there,
Hmm.
normal lap, then back downtown. And right at the finish line, I heard someone yell, someone else, "Let's go!" And I look over to my left, and it's Frank Shorter. And I give him the thumbs up sign, and I probably had a little chill.
Yeah.
He had said the year before, "You'll be back,"
And there you were.
and really it was an act of faith, that would I be able to do this? Would I be able to finish it? And so I'm going to check in and see if I can actually get in contact with him and thank him for his inspiration.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool.
So I'm afraid I didn't answer your question about the influences.
Oh yeah. I took a peek at my clock just now because I don't want to keep you too long. We're coming up on an hour here. So maybe let's I do want to hear that. So maybe let's maybe two more questions and then I'll let you get back to your ever busy work. Um, your influences, and then I wanted to also hear kind of how you think about the philosophy of sport and the future. And, part of what I'm trying to do with this is encourage more people to engage with us, to bring people to the organization. Because every now and then at the conference, we'll see people come in. I'm like, we got to grow. Like they've got new minds, new ideas, new people. So two pieces there. I want to hear your influences and how you think about the future of philosophy of sport.
Okay, well, I think maybe somewhat like if I understood you correctly, somewhat like you, I have a philosophical interest, and then I use sport as sort of field of application. And so, I'm really interested in issues in the philosophy of mind, consciousness, neurophilosophy. And so I find issues there that are interesting to me. And then I see, well, what in sport might illustrate this problem, or how might this issue affect our thinking about sport in certain ways, and challenge certain ways of thinking about sport, maybe customary ways to think about sport. So again, people like Searle, Thomas Nagel, David Chalmers, the Churchlands, Daniel Dennett. Uh, you mentioned Daniel Dennett and the defense of freedom. Some people say that he doesn't. What he calls freedom is not really freedom, and in fact, I think he sometimes now has some self-doubt about whether he should be speaking about freedom of the will in the way he uses the term. But those are a number of influences. I mentioned Kant early. Husserl, phenomenological tradition. Uh, Recently, Andy Clark, the notion of the extended mind and the predictive brain. He's written some fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's new to me. I'll need to make a note about that too. I'm not familiar with that work.
Uh, some of the stuff on neuroscience, early on, some of the stuff that was really accessible, like David Eagleman, who's kind of a popularizer of, I mean, he's a very esteemed neuroscientist, but he's kind of a popularizer of neuroscience.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, because I've kind of gone my own way, when I look at specifically at the philosophy of sport literature, I can't say that so and so has seminally influenced my thinking when it comes to what I work on in the philosophy of sport. Within the philosophy of sport tradition, certainly, as I said, there are people whose work I admire. I just said I work on different things, and
Yeah,
people whose style of writing I find, have an affinity for, like Simon and Kretschmar and John Russell and Dixon. I could name
yeah.
uh, a lot of other people, but so I guess that would be my response to the second question. Well, I think philosophy of sport is still like a burgeoning discipline. And I think there's now more classes being taught on the philosophy of sport. So it's a popular class, I think. So there's more of an opportunity to be exposed to the philosophy of sport in the universities. There have been journals that have started up dealing specifically with the philosophy of sport. So I think it's out there now. Media outlets are interested in talking to philosophers of sport. So I think it's out there in a way that and it's going to continue to grow, and there's going to be new issues that arise with artificial intelligence and esports and all of these kinds of things. For those who are young, starting out, who find that they're interested in this, and I would suggest go to some of the conferences, uh, submit work for a presentation at a conference, get some feedback, learn how to become more comfortable with standing up in front of an audience and fielding questions, and you know learning the skill that is involved in doing that. Maybe submit some of your work to a journal at some point. On all these cases, you're getting hopefully what will be valuable feedback and learning things about the discipline. To the extent it's possible, get involved in the organizations, read widely, both within and outside of the discipline. Expand your imagination and imagine ways you might think about philosophy of sport and issues you might deal with there. So that's just a few of the things I guess
Hmm.
I would point out.
One a nice thing to piggyback on that, I mentioned a few minutes ago that, I've been coming to IAPS for 10 years or so. The first one I went to was at Niagara and Danny Rosenberg hosted that. And I just remember being floored at his generosity and his welcoming nature and his kindness. And it was just like, I mean, he treats me, it was my first conference there, and he was just so kind. It was like I was being welcomed to my own family reunion or something. It's like, of course you belong here. Of course, it's like, wow. It was really welcoming. And then, as you said, I think especially as young academics, it's really intimidating and you get anxious about it. I remember perhaps the second IAPS I went to, I did a presentation where I was refuting Claudio Tamburini. Do you know Claudio Tamburini? So I was arguing with him, in paper. And I remember I got to my presentation and there he was sat in the front and center. He was the only one in the room. He was in the room before I was. And he had a notepad, a legal pad. And here I am to critique him. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be terrible. He's going to tear me apart. And so he sat quietly through my presentation and I saw him scratch notes and so forth. And then he couldn't have been more kind and generous and magnanimous afterward. He pointed out, maybe you've misunderstood this or that, and you should work on it and think about it. And he was just so generous and kind and graceful. And by and large, not always, but by and large, it's a kind of always like that. Um, it's just really great. So I would echo what you said, especially young people who are interested in this subject. It's a
Yeah,
small but great community.
yeah, and if you go to the conferences, whether it be the International Association for the Philosophy of Sport, British Philosophy of Sport
Yeah.
Association meeting, or the European or Japanese or what have you, don't be afraid to go up and talk to people, ask them questions. people will like it that you show interest in their work.
Yeah.
And speaking directly to IAPS, it's always been the case that they have tried to promote it as a kind of a family and a place where you could be nurtured uh, and get some good appreciative feedback.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say too.
And you can always, you have different experiences. You can learn from all of them. I almost hesitate to say this, but I once gave a presentation at a American Philosophical Association Central Division meeting, and no one showed up. So I went out into the hallway and I cajoled an individual to come and listen to me read my paper because it was going to be a line on my Vita, right?
Right.
And this individual gave me some really good feedback. I read my paper and the person gave me some really good feedback. So it was a valuable experience, uh,
Nice.
even in that respect.
Yeah, that's the other fun part about conferences. You usually see your name in the block, and it's I'm presenting at the same time as Mike back to me. Oh, shoot. Chances I get an audience are pretty low. So,
But even there, you'll find that there are individuals who will recognize that there's a young
yeah,
scholar here who's been slotted at the same time as a seasoned veteran, and they will go to support the young scholar.
yeah. Scott Kretschmar does that often, I've noticed. And I asked him about that once. It's like you could have seen John Russell talk, but you showed up to mine. And he said, I know John and I'm familiar with his work and I'll talk to him about it later. I don't know you. I want to learn your thing. So it was great. Well, I really appreciate this, Jeff. It's been fantastic. I love talking with you. I'm gonna wrap this up here. Let me go ahead for a second.